Mental fatigue is fundamentally distinct from physical sleepiness or simple exhaustion. It is not the dull ache in your muscles after a long run, nor is it the heavy eyelids that signal the end of a long day. Instead, it is a specific cognitive state born from intense, prolonged concentration. By separating these feelings, we can see that mental weariness is its own unique neurological event, requiring its own specialized form of recovery to restore the clarity needed for deep, meaningful work. This state manifests as a specific, subjective resistance to further voluntary effort. It acts as an internal friction that makes even basic tasks feel remarkably heavy and burdensome. As this resistance grows, the act of staying focused demands a high psychological price that becomes increasingly harder to pay. It is not a loss of skill or intelligence, but a shift in how the brain calculates the cost of effort, as our inner resources reach their limit and signal a necessary pause in activity. We must view this sensation as a biological signal rather than a lack of motivation. In a culture driven by constant productivity, we often mistake this weariness for personal failure or simple laziness. However, this feeling serves a protective role, warning us that our current energy expenditure is no longer sustainable for the system. It acts as a safety mechanism, preserving our neural health and preventing deeper damage, which makes listening to this signal a requirement for long-term cognitive health. The brain is an incredibly demanding organ, consuming roughly 20% of the body's total metabolic energy. Despite being only a small fraction of our weight, its constant activity requires a massive share of our internal resources. Every thought and decision carries a real metabolic cost, making the brain sensitive to any depletion. It must prioritize fuel for survival over the expensive luxury of higher-level thought, which explains why we experience such a sudden and noticeable drop in our focus. High-level cognitive processing requires an expensive type of biological fuel to function. Tasks like logic, strategic planning, and emotional regulation are not free. They rely on the most energy-hungry regions of the human cortex. When we engage in deep work, we burn through these neurochemical resources rapidly. As fuel dwindles, the brain throttles these expensive processes first, leaving only basic mental functions. This is why complex problem-solving becomes nearly impossible when we are mentally tired. We often assume our capacity for thought is abstract and limitless, like a digital stream with no physical source. This view ignores the physical reality that our minds are deeply rooted in biological tissue and cellular processes. We are not machines designed to run forever without any rest or maintenance. By recognizing that thinking has a physical basis, we can begin to respect the hard boundaries of our cognitive endurance. We are biological entities with tangible constraints that must be honored daily. Cognitive endurance has a hard physiological ceiling determined by our neurochemistry. This limit is not a hurdle to clear with willpower, but a structural boundary of our biology. When neurochemicals are depleted or metabolic waste accumulates in the synapses, performance inevitably begins to drop. No amount of grit or pressure can override the physical laws of neural transmission. Recognizing this ceiling allows for a more rational approach to effort, ensuring we do not push ourselves into a state of burnout. The core question is what actually breaks down within the brain's architecture when we get tired. Beyond the subjective feeling of exhaustion, we must look at the microscopic changes in synapses and neural pathways. We need to understand how specific brain regions, like the prefrontal cortex, lose the ability to sustain focus over time. By uncovering these hidden mechanisms, we can learn to work with our biology. This understanding turns fatigue from a frustration into a manageable reality that defines our shared experience. Executive function is the first system to degrade under a continuous load. These high-order processes act as the conductor of our mental orchestra, managing complex tasks and making critical decisions. When we are fresh, this system operates with precision, but as time passes, the conductor begins to tire. Our ability to plan and organize starts to falter, leaving our mental performance increasingly fragmented and less reliable as the hours pass by. Top-down processing requires the constant inhibition of our more automatic impulses. Our brains are naturally wired to react to immediate stimuli, but deep work demands that we ignore these urges to stay on a chosen path. This effort is a continuous act of self-control, which places a heavy burden on our neurological circuitry. As we push forward, the strength required to maintain this deliberate control begins to weaken, making us more susceptible to the path of least resistance. Sustaining attention involves a continuous and high metabolic cost for the nervous system. We often view attention as a passive observation, but it is actually an active and energy-intensive process of neural firing. To stay focused on a single point, the brain must dedicate a vast amount of fuel to maintain specific neural patterns. This constant expenditure means that focus is not just a mental state, but a physical exertion that consumes our limited biological resources. To maintain focus, the brain must actively suppress a constant stream of internal and external distractions. The world around us is filled with noise and competing thoughts that all fight for our attention. Our cognitive systems work tirelessly to filter out this irrelevant data, creating a quiet space for deep thought. This filtering process is invisible, yet it is one of the most demanding tasks the brain performs, as it requires a constant effort to push away the unnecessary. This suppression mechanism gradually depletes our available neural resources over time. Every time we ignore a notification or a wandering thought, we use up a small portion of our mental energy. Like a battery slowly draining, the ability to say no to distractions becomes harder as the day progresses. Eventually, the mechanism reaches a point of exhaustion, and our ability to maintain a clear and focused mental environment begins to crumble, leaving us vulnerable to every passing whim. Rapid task switching significantly accelerates the onset of this resource depletion. Every time we move between different tasks, the brain must engage in a costly reconfiguration process. This switching cost burns through metabolic fuel far faster than staying on a single path. By jumping between different projects, we are effectively redlining our cognitive engine. This frantic activity quickly drains our reserves, leading to a state of exhaustion much sooner than if we had practiced singular focus. Working memory capacity effectively shrinks as the cognitive load persists throughout the day. This mental workspace, where we hold and manipulate information, is highly sensitive to fatigue. When we are tired, we find it harder to keep multiple variables in mind at once. We may lose track of our place in a complex argument or struggle with basic logic. This narrowing of our mental bandwidth is a clear sign that our resources are reaching their absolute limit and cannot sustain more pressure. The mind eventually forces a defensive shift from controlled to automatic processing. This is a survival tactic where the brain stops using expensive executive functions and starts relying on habits and routines. We stop thinking deeply and start reacting instinctively, which requires far less energy to sustain. While this shift protects the brain from further damage, it also ends our ability to do high-quality work. It is the brain's final way of saying that it is time for a genuine period of rest. The lateral prefrontal cortex is the primary brain region affected by mental fatigue. This area manages executive control, helping us focus on complex tasks and goals. When tired, this area loses its efficiency, making it much harder to stay organized. It is the first system to struggle under strain, leading to a noticeable drop in our daily cognitive performance as the day goes on. Recent research points to the accumulation of glutamate in synapses as a key cause of exhaustion. Glutamate is used during thinking, but builds up between neurons during periods of intense work. Instead of being cleared away, it lingers and disrupts the normal flow of information. This chemical imbalance is why our thoughts feel increasingly slower and less clear as we try to focus. High concentrations of glutamate outside neurons can become toxic to the brain over time. This buildup creates an unhealthy environment that eventually leads to cellular stress. The brain is sensitive to these changes and must maintain balance to function. Excess glutamate acts as a metabolic warning sign, indicating that our internal system is no longer operating in a safe state. Fatigue operates as a safety mechanism to prevent potential neural damage from this toxicity. When the brain senses a dangerous buildup, it triggers weariness to force us to stop. It is a biological emergency brake that makes work feel much harder than it truly is. By making effort feel painful, the brain protects itself from the long-term risks of extreme and chronic overexertion. The brain requires significant downtime to clear these metabolic byproducts effectively and restore balance. This process is not instant, as the brain needs low activity for its cleaning mechanisms to function properly. During rest, excess glutamate is recycled, allowing the environment to return to normal. Without recovery, chemical clutter remains, leading to poor performance and fog. Adenosine buildup increases sleep pressure alongside cognitive exhaustion. Adenosine is a byproduct of energy use that accumulates all day, acting as an internal timer for rest. As levels rise, they dampen neural activity and make us feel sluggish. This pressure works with fatigue to signal that our window for work has closed, pushing us toward the need for restorative sleep. Dopaminergic pathways in the striatum show reduced responsiveness to rewards when we are tired. Dopamine drives motivation, helping us weigh the value of a task against the effort needed. When exhausted, these pathways are less sensitive, making once exciting goals feel less appealing. The cost of work rises while the reward feels smaller, making it hard to maintain drive and interest. The signal-to-noise ratio in neural firing begins to degrade significantly as we reach our limit. In a fresh mind, signals are clear, but fatigue introduces a form of internal static. The brain must work harder to find relevant information, leading to more errors and much slower thinking. This loss of precision is the final sign that our biological resources are completely spent. Fatigue fundamentally alters how the brain evaluates the balance between cost and reward. When we are rested, the mind willingly invests energy into complex challenges because the payoff feels attainable. However, as resources dwindle, this internal calculation shifts. The effort required for even simple tasks begins to outweigh the potential benefits. We naturally start to value energy conservation over achievement, causing us to instinctively pull back from high levels of engagement. The anterior cingulate cortex acts as the primary neural hub for monitoring this effort and reward ratio. This region serves as a metabolic accountant, tallying the price of our actions against the value of our goals. When the cost rises too high, it generates the specific sensation of effort. This signal is designed to discourage us from wasting precious neural resources on tasks that the brain no longer prioritizes, acting as a guide for our limited biological energy. As fatigue rises, the subjective cost of any given task increases with dramatic intensity. What felt like a minor chore in the morning can feel like an exhausting marathon by late afternoon. The brain magnifies this perception of effort to force a change in our behavior. Every decision feels heavier, sounding an internal alarm that our current path is becoming too expensive to follow without a break. This heightened sensitivity ensures that we do not deplete ourselves entirely. The brain eventually predicts that further effort is biologically too expensive to maintain effectively. Our cognitive systems forecast the impact of continued activity on our limited metabolic reserves. If the brain anticipates a total depletion, it will preemptively shut down our drive to work. This proactive defense ensures that we stop before reaching a point of irreversible neural stress or lasting cellular damage, protecting the long-term health of our cognitive architecture. Attention begins to narrow into a form of rigid, cognitive tunnel vision as our focus degrades. In a rested state, we can maintain a broad perspective and see how tasks fit into a larger strategy. Fatigue strips away this wide-angle view, forcing the mind to zero in on small details while losing its strategic grip. This narrowing saves energy by limiting information processing, but it prevents us from seeing more efficient ways to solve the complex problems we face. Peripheral awareness and sensory gating mechanisms start to weaken as we lose our mental grip. These filters are responsible for prioritizing important information while ignoring the background noise of life. When we are tired, these gates become porous, and the distinction between important signals and irrelevant data begins to blur. This loss of control over what we perceive makes it incredibly difficult to stay anchored in the specific task we are trying to perform. Irrelevant sensory inputs, like distant noise or visual clutter, become much harder for the brain to filter out. A ticking clock or a hum in the room can suddenly feel intrusive and incredibly distracting. This happens because the active process of suppression is failing due to a lack of metabolic power. The brain can no longer afford to keep these distractions away, adding to our overall feeling of being overwhelmed and further draining our remaining mental reserves. Finally, the perception of time may feel distorted or heavily dragged out as the brain struggles to process reality. When cognitive processing slows down, a single minute can feel much longer than its objective length. This distortion occurs because the brain is working harder to process less information, creating a sense of internal friction. Each moment feels like a struggle, signaling that our mental machinery is in desperate need of a full and restorative period of rest. Impulse control is significantly reduced when the prefrontal cortex is tired. This region acts as a vital filter against distractions and immediate urges. When energy drops, this filter weakens and becomes porous. We find ourselves acting on impulses we normally suppress, such as checking our devices or giving in to cravings. This loss of control is not a character flaw, but a direct result of exhaustion in the brain's command center, making focus difficult to sustain. Emotional regulation relies heavily on these depleted energy resources to function. Managing our feelings is an active process, requiring constant oversight from the brain's higher centers. When the cortex is drained of fuel, it cannot modulate emotional signals effectively. We become more reactive and less resilient, struggling with situations we would typically handle with calm. This heightened reactivity is a symptom of a mind that simply lacks the fuel to keep itself balanced. Negative emotions surface easily without the benefit of cortical dampening. Primitive regions like the amygdala generate signals of fear or anger, which the cortex usually soothes. When fatigue sets in, this mechanism fails. Minor annoyances feel like major crises, and we feel irritable for no clear reason. This happens because the brain's internal brakes are no longer working to maintain our usual sense of emotional stability, leaving our feelings raw and unfiltered. Decision fatigue leads to choosing the path of least cognitive resistance as a survival strategy. Every choice we make throughout the day consumes a portion of our mental energy. When exhausted, the brain avoids complex options to save its remaining fuel. We often default to the easiest or most familiar choice, even if it is not the best one. This is why making important decisions late in the day feels impossible, as the brain proactively saves its energy for survival. Complex analysis is replaced by flawed heuristics as the brain tires. Heuristics are mental shortcuts for quick judgments that do not require deep thinking. As our logic fades, we rely on these simple patterns to navigate the world. This shift saves biological energy, but often leads to incorrect conclusions or missed nuances. We trade accuracy for speed because the brain cannot afford the heavy metabolic cost of critical evaluation during periods of intense exhaustion. Social cognition and empathy require energy that is no longer available in a fatigued state. Truly understanding others is a demanding task that requires significant focus and self-regulation. When we are mentally depleted, we become more self-centered and less patient. Our social awareness shrinks, making us less likely to engage in the deep empathy that sustains our connections. We simply lack the fuel required to step outside our own immediate needs. We often misinterpret this biological state as a personal failure or a sign of weakness. Instead of seeing a brain that is out of fuel, we criticize ourselves for being lazy or unmotivated. This self-blame adds unnecessary stress to an already exhausted system. Realizing that fatigue is a physical reality allows us to let go of this guilt. By seeing exhaustion as an organ state rather than a character flaw, we can approach our limits with much more logic and compassion. Procrastination emerges as a functional defense against further depletion of our resources. When we avoid a difficult task, the brain is signaling that the cognitive cost is currently too high to pay. It is a protective delay, showing that the system needs recovery before engaging in expensive activity. By seeing procrastination as a biological red flag, we can stop fighting ourselves and start focusing on the recovery needed to return to a state of high performance. Mental fatigue is essentially a functional homeostatic emotion. Much like hunger or thirst, it is the brain's way of monitoring its internal state and signaling a shift in its biological needs. Just as hunger tells us we need fuel, this specific form of weariness tells us we need a cessation of cognitive effort. It is an internal metric that helps maintain the balance of our system, ensuring that we do not stray too far from a sustainable baseline of energy expenditure during our daily lives. This feeling serves the same protective purpose as physical pain signals within the body. When we touch a hot surface, pain forces us to withdraw to prevent tissue damage. Similarly, mental fatigue forces a withdrawal from demanding cognitive tasks to protect the delicate architecture of the brain. It is an evolutionary adaptation designed to keep us safe from the consequences of extreme overexertion. By treating it with the same respect as physical pain, we can better safeguard our long-term neurological health. Pushing through intense fatigue yields rapidly diminishing cognitive returns for our work. There is a common misconception that more hours spent on a task always leads to more progress. However, once the brain has signaled its exhaustion, the quality of our output plummets while the rate of error climbs. We often spend more time fixing mistakes made in a tired state than we would if we had simply rested. True efficiency comes from recognizing when the brain is no longer capable of producing its best work. The modern environment often ignores these hard biological constraints in favor of constant activity. We live in a world that prizes 24/7 availability and relentless productivity, often treating the human mind like a machine that never needs to cool down. This cultural pressure creates a significant disconnect between our biological reality and our daily expectations. By ignoring these natural limits, we create a state of chronic stress that undermines the very focus and creativity we are trying to maximize in our lives. Chronic overriding of this vital signal can lead to the profound state of long-term burnout. When we repeatedly ignore the brain's calls for rest, the system begins to enter a state of permanent alarm. This is not a state that can be fixed with a single night of sleep or a short weekend away. Burnout represents a deeper collapse of our cognitive and emotional systems, where the drive to engage with the world is fundamentally compromised by months or years of sustained and unaddressed exhaustion. Burnout involves real structural changes in the brain rather than just temporary resource depletion. Research suggests that chronic exhaustion can lead to a thinning of the prefrontal cortex and an overactive amygdala. These are not just feelings, but physical shifts in the way our brain is wired to handle stress and information. Recovery from this state takes significant time because the brain must literally rebuild its capacity to regulate itself and engage with complex tasks effectively once again. Willpower is not a separate, mystical force that exists apart from our biological energy supply. We often think of it as a muscle that can be infinitely strengthened, but it is deeply tied to our metabolic state. If the brain is low on fuel or high on metabolic waste, willpower simply cannot function at its peak. It is a biological resource that is subject to the same laws of depletion as any other system in the body. Understanding this allows us to stop blaming our character for what is actually a metabolic reality. Acknowledging our biological limits is a rational and strategic approach rather than a defeatist one. It takes wisdom to recognize that we are not limitless and that our best work comes from a place of balance. By respecting the metabolic cycles of the mind, we can create a sustainable rhythm that allows for both high performance and deep recovery. This shift in perspective turns the management of fatigue into a tool for excellence, ensuring that we remain effective and clear throughout our entire lives. Recovery requires much more than just stopping a specific task. Simply walking away from a desk does not mean the healing process has begun in earnest. True restoration involves a deliberate transition where the nervous system can finally release its defensive posture. It is a slow descent into stillness, allowing our mental machinery to cool down and reset before we engage with the world again in a meaningful way. Active rest differs significantly from low-quality stimulation like digital scrolling. We often mistake passive consumption for relaxation, but checking screens keeps the brain in a frantic state. This junk food for the mind prevents the deep restoration that only comes from silence or gentle activities. To truly recover, we must choose paths that do not demand our attention, giving the cortex the space it needs to fully disengage. Sleep is the only mechanism that fully activates the vital glymphatic system. This is the brain's unique waste management system, which only opens its channels during the deepest stages of rest. While we are awake, the brain is too busy processing data to focus on its own cleanliness. It is only when we surrender to sleep that the brain can perform its most essential maintenance to ensure our long-term mental health and clarity. This system washes away the accumulated glutamate and toxins that build up during our hours of focus. Throughout a demanding day, the spaces between our neurons become cluttered with chemical waste that slows down thinking. During deep sleep, the brain flushes these toxins away to maintain the clarity of our thought processes. It is the invisible reset that ensures our cognitive landscape is clean and ready for a brand new day. Understanding fatigue fundamentally changes how we structure our intellectual work. We can no longer view our productivity as a flat line that remains constant throughout the day. Instead, we must learn to map our most demanding tasks to our moments of peak chemical readiness. By organizing our days around the natural ebb and flow of our neurochemistry, we can achieve more while suffering from significantly less internal friction and stress. This knowledge shifts our focus from brute intensity toward a sustainable and healthy rhythm. In the past, we might have tried to force our way through exhaustion with sheer willpower. Now, we realize that such a path leads only to diminishing returns. Sustainable work is built on intervals where periods of deep concentration are followed by periods of true disengagement. By embracing this rhythm, we protect our long-term creativity and focus. A clear mind requires deep respect for its metabolic cycles and physical needs. We are biological beings before we are productive workers, and our thoughts are bound by the same laws as our heartbeat. When we honor these cycles, we stop fighting our own biology and start working in harmony with it. This respect is not a sign of weakness, but a hallmark of a rational approach to life and a direct reflection of how we manage our energy. Cognitive clarity emerges from balancing intense effort with thorough biological recovery. We cannot have one without the other, as the two are linked in a loop of performance and renewal. By understanding the neuroscience of fatigue, we gain the tools to master our focus and preserve our health. We move toward the wisdom of boundaries and the key to a life of sustained insight, where the mind remains a sharp and reliable instrument.